Welcome to episode 3 of the Biltmore Church podcast. Our church exists to glorify God by making disciples of Jesus who reach up, reach in, and reach out. And this podcast is a brand new tool that will hopefully help you do just that. My name is Christian Cooper. I serve on staff here at the church, and I'm here today with our lead pastor, Bruce Frank, and Kevin Wimbish is our special guest today. Kevin is a co-owner of Summit Wellness Centers here in Western North Carolina. That's a Christian counseling and coaching practice committed to Christian values and clinical excellence. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist, an ordained pastor, and trained in executive coaching. Is that it?
It's a long resume.
There's more. I'm not even done. He enjoys working with individuals, couples, and organizations who want to move to the next level of personal and professional development. And then personally, he's been married to his wonderful wife, Julie, for 19 years, and they have 2 great kids, McLean, who is 15, and Claire, who is 12. Kevin, thanks for jumping on with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm looking forward to our conversation. Before we jump into some of our questions we've got kind of written down already, I want to start by just looking back to services from last Sunday. You guys were both at church. Another powerful Sunday in this series. Can we talk about it? And so I want to open up the floor. Just what are some of the highlights for you guys? What were some of the things that just in the last couple of days you've been thinking about that have really stood out from Sunday?
Really that spiral of depression. I mean, that was a great visual and just great things that folks can look at, in their own lives. That was huge. And then talking about depression and relationships, and when we're having a hard time, it is very normal for us to pull away from relationships, but that's the last thing we need to do. So the importance of community in the midst of those things is huge.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Pastor Bruce, with that downward spiral graphic, it seemed like a huge help to a lot of our people. I wanted just to kind of get a peek behind the curtain maybe a little bit with how that thing formed, where that came from during prep during the week.
Yeah, I mean, some of it was somewhat self-reflective as you looked at Elijah and then you looked in the mirror. Some of those things just started to become the pattern that you saw or that I saw, whether you deal with, Jeremiah or his depression or Moses or any of them. It's like there were certain characteristics, and then you look in the mirror and you're like, well, if I didn't do that, that was certainly a temptation or a tendency that I was drawn to, particularly, obviously, a lot of this is coming out of the last 2.5 years of the different kind of stuff. And nobody came out of that without some strain and stress, preachers included. And so some of it was self-reflective. And then just as I put it down, I was like, well, this is sort of the pattern. You see it, we're a Bible teaching church. And so it's kind of right there. This is where it starts. This is where it goes. Here's where the danger zone is. And that's what I was telling you a little bit earlier. That danger zone part was like, all right, looking back mainly, I was like, all right, that could have gone one of 2 ways. And the temptation to not pick up the phone, for example, and, in my case, like my 3 brothers, we keep in contact all the time. And a couple times I'm like, you know what? I just don't want to get on that Zoom call. I don't want to be told what I should do. I just want to sit over here and have my pity party. Yep.
I heard you say it. I think the way you said it on Sunday was sometimes you're going to have to do the thing that you don't want to do or make the choice that you really don't want to make.
Sure.
Kevin, I'm sure this is something that you see a lot, that downward spiral. Is this, week to week, being a licensed therapist, you deal with this quite a bit, or is, everyone kind of in these stages? What did you think of that graphic?
That was very good. I mean, so many of us are visual learners, and so being able to see it up there, watching out. I talk with people a lot about indicators. Jesus talked a lot about being aware, being awake, and I think that's huge in this world. So being aware of those things, watching out for those potential indicators, friends knowing those so they can ask us about things, all that was huge.
Again, great Sunday. Looking forward to even the next 3. The series is flying by, but another powerful week. I want to encourage you, if you're listening and you haven't gotten a chance to hear the sermon or watch the service, to go back and watch that thing on YouTube. A very, very, very powerful Sunday. But today, we're going to be talking about emotional health and relationships at home and at work. So I think no matter what season of life you're in, today's conversation is going to be a help for you. I'm looking forward to helping me in my own journey. So first of all, just wanted to ask you, Kevin, just to kick off our conversation, as we talked about earlier, this teaching series on emotional health and the gospel. How do our relationships with others, particularly those closest relationships, how do they relate to this idea of emotional health?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about how God has created us, so he's made us spiritual beings, mental, emotional, relational, physical. And if any of those areas kind of get out of whack, it impacts every other area. So it's important for us to dial into all these. And so, if we're not feeling well emotionally, then we might not treat people as well as we would like to. If our relationships are not going well, if we're feeling isolated, we're getting lost in our heads, like you talked about yesterday, that's going to impact us negatively emotionally. So it's very reciprocal relationships, emotions, and relationships.
What would you say are some of the biggest threats to that emotional health within relationships?
I'll start theoretical. We'll start a little theoretical first. I
Sure.
will get practical because I'm a big believer in both. But some of the theoretical is kind of heart stuff. Honestly, in our day, just the elevation, even emotion, even the worship of emotions, the self. You talked about yesterday in terms of the emotions being that river and the mind and the will being the banks. I've heard you say before, emotions are a great caboose, but a terrible engine. I quote you on that all the time. I mean, that's huge. And obviously I care about emotions. I mean, I'm a counselor, so that's part of the deal. But we can't let them drive the train for sure. And unfortunately in our culture, that's the covert and often overt message now, that whatever you feel is absolute truth, and go and do that, which is very dangerous.
And I'm sure, Pastor, you see this from a pastoral element, especially if that illustration is yours, that caboose engine thing.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that one for years, and a lot of that is, and kind of what the genesis of the series is going back to Augustine's comment, 5th century theologian. He was just talking, in his case, he was like the smoke is an indicator of the fire, and the emotions are like the smoke saying what's down deep beneath that. And so when you talk about emotions, sometimes it's hard to pare it down, but it's looking at emotions, but it's trying to look at the root causes, as well. And so like, if you take about like last week about, there was like 5 or 6 that came from that, but the root was unforgiveness. But from that come everything from, super critical for other people, anger. A lot of times you'll even see, a lot of times Jesus pairs unforgiveness and anger. He pairs them together from Matthew 5 to, a number of places is like, okay, that's coming from that. And so that's what we're trying to do, be practical, but also go, look below the surface, because if you just put a Band-Aid on it, it's like you got root and you have fruit. We're trying to mainly look at the root with the application to the fruit, because people see the fruit and, to Kevin's point, but if you don't get to the root, it's just a short-lived victory.
I'm stuck on that root fruit.
It just came to me. I was like, hey, I like that. It's like, I got to write that down. So.
That is gold right there. So Kevin, to put you on the spot a little bit, as we kind of continue this conversation, what would you say are some of those relationships that are most prevalent when you see kind of these negative effects of emotional health, people taking out the negative emotions on other people? What specific relationships are we usually talking about from your experience?
Often it shows up in marriage, big time, at home, big time. Unfortunately, often we can treat folks at work better than we treat folks in our own homes. Often we're tired at the end of the day, our guard's down, all that kind of stuff. We're not as focused, and so we're not treating them as well, unfortunately. Now, it can show up at work as well, but often it shows up at home.
So what would you say, just starting block for emotional health and relationships, some of the early practical stuff to kind of drift that way for a moment? That you would hand people, it's maybe I'm coming in first time sitting down in your office and you're starting to see these kind of things pop up. What would you immediately say? Or how would you kind of guide someone in that process?
It's important for us to have a frame of reference, big time. That's not our emotions and what we fully feel about whatever. And so that's one of those dangers too, I think, is going on in our society of, I can say my truth as that plan is red, and you can say your truth as it's green, and that obviously is not going to work well when those things don't line up. And so it helped Julie and I super early in our relationship that we decided that whatever the Bible says on something is going to be the deal. I mean, we don't do it perfectly. We mess up and all that kind of stuff, but that was just our covering of it. It's clear. When the Bible says something clearly, that's going to be the deal in terms of our marriage and family. So you got to have that external reference point that you both follow. That's huge in marriage. And
I've heard you say some version of kind of what kind of water are you swimming in?
Yes.
Using that analogy.
Yes.
I'd love to just let you kind of give you a runway to talk about that idea for a moment.
Yeah. Sometimes people might say, Kevin, why are you talking about all this theoretical stuff, philosophical stuff? And it really does matter because it matters how we think.
Sure.
And so it's kind of like a fish. It's going to be dirty or clean relative to how clean or dirty the water is in which it swims. And that water might be pretty dirty, but over time that fish might kind of be okay swimming in that water, but it's still going to be affected and infected by that dirty water. And so it's important for us to be aware of this water in which we swim. Paul in Romans 12 says, do not be conformed. I like the NIV, it says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world. And so in order for us to not be conformed to a pattern, we have to know what the pattern is,
And even the rest of that verse is talking about how are you transformed by the renewing of your mind. So I know, he's like, I don't want to be too theoretical, but as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. And so before we ever do anything, we think it.
Yes.
And so even if it's a split second before we lose our temper or, or their wife or whatever. So, unless you change, one of the beautiful things I think about the gospel is it changes you from the inside out. And that's what we have to go back over and over and over again. I mean, you can just try to hold it all under, but it's like my buddy Joby Martin. I think he's the first one that ever said, if you try to do it that way externally, it's like trying to hold that beach ball underwater. How long can you do that? Well, it depends. Depends on, how strong you are, how big the waves are, how much suntan lotion you have on. But at some point, it's going to come out.
That's right.
And so what the gospel does is take a knife to the beach ball and takes the power out of it, and then you can have genuine change.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Starting from the bottom.
Yes.
Starting at the fire and the smoke. Plenty of analogies we can use for it. One of the things that I've heard really both of you kind of touch on that I want to almost kind of meet in the middle is this idea of that if the gospel's the water we should be swimming in, on the other side of that, we've got some water that we often find ourselves swimming in, and that's that idea of the world and the flesh and the devil and what those practical implications are and how those things are even, they kind of go in a certain order. And I would love to kind of just open up a discussion for a few minutes about that. I first heard about that in John Mark Comer's book, his recent book, and then we talked about it a good deal in the Gospel of John, especially. You're going to have to remind me which part it's in off the top of my head.
Chapter 8, you'll know the truth will set you free.
That's
Is
it.
that what you're
It's a Bible quiz.
I'm just reading your mind right
Pass
here.
the Bible quiz. That's great. That is great. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's very important for us, again, going back to being aware and being awake. I think it was John Piper who said, you'll never know what prayer is for until you see that life is war. And that can sound a little scary, but I think it's real, and we got to calibrate our minds in that direction. So, the world is kind of the collective sin system that's obviously against God, as I talked about, Paul in Romans 12, the patterns of this world, that we got to be mindful of and watch out for. The messages that are being put up here. And we've got a lot of messages now coming in all kinds of different ways. And then we've got the flesh, in here. In Romans 8, Paul says that it's hostile towards God. And we got to be real about that, and we got to be honest about that, And even in Romans 7, he talks about that internal wrestling match, and this guy wrote so much of the New Testament, he's got this internal wrestling match, so of course we all do. And then we've got the devil, and you talked about apex predators yesterday, and 1 Peter 5:8 talks about he's like a roaring lion, and so he's coming after us. So we got to be real about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and Comer's book is good. That new one was I can't remember what the title of it is.
Live No Lies.
Yeah, Live No Lies. Excellent job. But how the world, the flesh, and the devil, how they intersect. I think the one thing we can be clear on is the fact that there's no way to totally. Even if you go to a monastery, you're still going to have to. You still have the flesh you're going to have to deal with. But what we do is, since we don't live there, you're living in a world that, pretty much all day, every day, a lot of this stuff, not every stuff, but a lot of this stuff it's the antithesis of what truth is. Kevin's point about how, objective truth or subjective truth, but that is it for sure. Because the God right now is whatever you feel, that is your truth. And what we have to feel is like, okay, that can actually be, that's not reality, just, whether it be the plant or even the whispers, because there is truth and there's not truth. So if a lot of the gospel stuff is, all right, what does God say about you? That's why we say over and over and over and over again until people get tired, because when they're tired of it, they're just now getting it.
Yep.
Okay, and so the idea is only Jesus gets to define who you are. Now, if you're in Christ, that means a ton of great stuff, and that is reality. If you're not in Christ, that means a ton of stuff. That's reality. It's not anywhere near as good. But I think the internal change that has to happen, the world's going to tell you one thing, so part of that is Bible intake. I got to replace the stuff I'm hearing, because you can't get away from it. Yep. You see it on a billboard, you see it on commercials. You got billions of dollars being spent on marketing trying to tell us stuff. You are what you drive, just 100 different things. And so what it can do is we'll just chase it around. So going back to community, getting in the Word, prayer, those are just things where God can tell us truth over and over again, because you're going to get the other one almost without even trying. That's right. Because that's the water we swim in. So if you don't have some other stuff that's helping filter that out, then, you're going to eventually be conformed, and that's usually leads nowhere good.
Yeah, nothing to draw from in that moment, other than what the message that the world is giving you.
That's right.
I think one of the things that, just hearing you say that, even as a pastor, sometimes I almost feel bad for encouraging people to take those elementary steps of faith, even in the midst of emotional health, like you just said, Bible intake, community, having people around you, prayer. Those things seem so elementary, but those in some ways feel like you got to go back to those basic things if you're going to start to see victory in your emotional health. Yeah. And I'm sure, I don't know what to say to the person who doesn't have that identity in Christ. That's really that first step. But other practical application points you would hand people along the way, especially in their relationships with others. We've talked a lot about, again, because we need to, what's going on internally, but how that starts to manifest in your relationships.
Yeah. I will go there. I do want to piggyback off something you said a minute ago, because a lot of times in our society we think we know things. And so, unless it's new information or the next whatever, we can discount it versus going to some of those basic things. I talk about getting your reps in. And so practice time and game time. Practice time is not in the heightened moment of stress. It's when I'm having my morning quiet time. It's when I'm replenishing my mind, renewing my mind. That's super important, because I don't know what game time is going to bring later that day. And so just getting those reps in is huge.
Yeah.
But then some super practical things in terms of relationships, choosing to give the other person the benefit of the doubt. And so if we're having conflict, it's the brain's normal tendency to go ahead and start noticing other things that fit with that negative narrative about that other person. And so grabbing those thoughts, I tell people, start to consider, is what I'm thinking about helping me? Instead of just letting stuff roll around up there. So grab those thoughts. Assume positive intent, keeping short accounts. That's huge. So don't let stuff fester. Those little things become big things. And so go after those little things, talk about those things. Just some tried and true things, assertiveness and active listening. Assertiveness is pretty much expressing oneself, thoughts, feelings, that sort of thing. Active listening can feel a little bit weird. It's saying, I hear you saying such and such. Am I hearing you correctly?
Oh, don't I know it? I was waiting to tell a story about this.
It feels robotic, mechanical.
Right.
But I tell you, it does a great forcing function, because in my experience, what often happens is, let's say if we were in conflict, we just keep batting back and forth opinions and thoughts. It's like verbal ping pong. And typically if you're saying something, I'm already thinking about my rebuttal to what you're saying while you're saying it. And so I'm not even listening. But active listening means, okay, in 60 seconds, I'm going to have to tell Christian what I think I heard him say, so I probably should listen. So assertiveness, active listening are huge.
Yeah.
When we went through, my wife and I went through premarital counseling. It was Steve Cassell back in the day. And he handed us that tool of, hey, when you find yourself in conflict, try saying like, what I'm hearing you say is this, and it makes me feel this. And so, of course, right after we got married, we were in an argument. And Ashley was wise enough to bring that out and use it. And I was so mad at myself for not realizing that, like, I should have done this, that it just infuriated me. And I was like, don't you use that tool on me. I don't want to hear that, But what was really going on is, again, it goes right back to Pastor Bruce, your point a minute ago. That tool was great. And if used effectively, super helpful. Underneath the surface there, and in my case, when I was upset, that was just what was going on internally inside of me.
Yes.
And so that those things work so closely together. You pull one out of the equation, all of a sudden it's off balance
Big
again.
time.
Yeah. And sometimes, every once in a while, if Lori and I if it's kind of rising up, one of us will just say, same team, same team. In other words, listen, husband and wife, we're on the same team, so we're not attacking each other. Let's attack the problem. What are we dealing with? So just, you got to be careful when you pull out same team. But it's if it's not too escalated and you just say, hey, we're on the same team, it's just a reminder, hey, listen, we're on the same team. We're not going at each other. We're not trying to win the argument, even though, because that's what it, that's what it can get to, especially if you're a person that wants to win all the time, which that's my wife. Just kidding. It's me. That's me. So anyway, just remembering you're on the same team can kind of bring it back to the main point, just a simple practical thing that's helped us over a few decades.
Kevin, one of the things I heard you say a second ago, talking about, I think you said keep short accounts.
Yeah.
And it reminds me a lot of that. It's, the wisdom in overlooking an offense. I personally can't do that apart from the gospel, even a small thing. And it goes right back to our forgiveness discussion, or forgiveness message from last week is, sometimes there are these big things that, need addressing, need like serious forgiveness. I'm going to write the name down and break the stick like we did. And there's other things you just got to let go. And I'm sure that's something that you talk so much about, especially in marriages. And with close relationships, I'm sure kids as well. But again, it just goes right back to that biblical wisdom that's laying underneath that practical idea.
I'd say a great chapter just as a resource. My friend J.D. Greer has a book called Gospel, and one of the chapters, I don't know what chapter it is like gospel-centered relationships. And I remember he was talking about how he and his wife were, they had the same kind of ping pong going back and forth, and then just talked about, think of yourself as sinner first, sinned against second. Sinner first, sinned against second. Going back to Paul's admonition to Timothy, it's like, listen, I'm the foremost of sinners. But just like before, you're like, what, you did this to me. It just gets grace back into the marriage when it comes to marriage, and it goes to any relationship. But I just remember that. I remember reading that chapter maybe 8 or 9 years ago, going, oh, that's gold right there. Sinner first, sinned against second.
That connects with another practical that I often recommend is taking time out. And I even recommend it in marriage and parenting, giving myself a timeout sometimes. If I
you put yourself in timeout?
If I need to take a break, if I feel it welling up, and even different things in the brain start to happen. I think Donna's going to talk about that. But, we're often not thinking clearly and logically, and that's why we say things that we don't mean. Because different things are going on up here. And so taking a healthy time out is huge. One of the things I tell folks to do in taking a time out is, like Jesus said, look at the log in your own eye before the speck in your brother's eye. Because the flesh wants to be right. And it gets into this win-lose kind of thing, versus, and I don't do it all the time, but when I do it, it goes a lot better than when I don't. I promise you that. But if we can go away and really pray through, all right, Lord, so my wife's Julie, as you said, if we're having a conflict, if I can pull away and go, all right, Lord, help me to see what's the log in my eye first. And even though it's the size difference, he's saying, Kevin, when I'm talking to you, go ahead and assume it's a log and assume hers is a speck. And then that brings a nice place of humility. And then we're able to come back and work for the best interest of the marriage. I'm not trying to just win.
That is so helpful. Be stewing on that one for a while.
Yeah, it's hard to call a timeout on yourself because you're like, I want to win.
I know, that's right.
So, that's the
I don't want to stop the momentum.
Yeah.
Call a timeout when you have momentum.
I see I'm almost ready to conquer. It's just like, anyway, doesn't go anywhere good.
That type A personality types at work right there. I think we need a little bit extra counseling, Kevin.
How much you charge? Because we both need it.
I said I don't do it all the time either, but when I do, it goes a lot better.
That's good.
Oh, that's great. I want to switch gears for a second and lean into a couple of those close relationships. We've been talking a lot about marriage. I want to also talk about parenting, and then work after that. But let's start with parenting. Same kind of principles, or is it different? What are your thoughts on application points for people? And healthy conflict really is what we've been talking about mostly.
Very similar in terms of you need that external reference point. Ours is the Bible, and so that guides. That's the frame for all of us. That's huge. In terms of parenting, getting your kids around godly Christian families, that's huge. Otherwise, they're going to think mom and dad is the weird one saying all this stuff, But if they're around other good, solid Christian families, that's been huge for our kids. Teaching them to be discerners of information, I think is huge. Teach them to be thinkers. I'm sure it's driven my kids crazy over the years when I will say, what do you think the message in this show is about this person? Or what are they trying to get you to buy into, that sort of thing.
That's good.
That's huge. Because, when they leave our house, I'm not going to be able to tell them exactly how to navigate each situation. They're going to have some principles, some biblical worldviews through which to see so they can make good decisions. So those are huge.
I'm not a parent, but one of the things I see a lot, to your point, is there's, especially with believers, with followers of Jesus, is this either like we're going to retreat entirely from what's going on in our world. You're not going to watch a single movie or show or whatever, and or just that we're just going to pretend like nothing's happening. It seems like you're advocating for finding that middle ground. And addressing in a healthy way.
Yes. My wife's a public school teacher. My kids are in public school. We love the public schools. And so you got to figure out how to follow Christ in the midst of wherever you are. Yeah.
So then lastly, talk about work. No one's ever had conflict at work. Definitely never happened among anyone, especially pastors. That never happens. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about just those emotional health relationships with work relationships.
Very similar principles, but keeping those short accounts is going to be huge. Developing those real authentic relationships where we have conversations like this. Because what we're doing by when you preach on these things, when we talk about it here, we're normalizing it for other people. We're letting other people know, hey, it's okay. We're all human. We need to talk about these things. We all wrestle with things, that sort of thing. So keeping short accounts, choosing to give the benefit of the doubt. When an email comes through or a text or whatever, let me go ahead and assume this person, give them, think maybe they just had a bad day or maybe they're tired or something like that. Assume they didn't mean anything by it. Keeping short accounts in terms of, I'm a big fan of help me understand, and so help me understand what you meant by that, or help me understand when you said this, that sort of thing. And then that assertiveness, active listening, taking a break when you need to cool off, go get some coffee, whatever. All those things can help in home life and at work life as well.
And as I'm sitting here listening to go of all those phenomenal practical tips, those are actually, what he's explaining is the outworking of 1 Corinthians 13.
Wow.
I mean, love bears all things, believes all things. We're putting him in tools that are more easily understood. Yeah. But if you look at it, he's fleshing out what is a definition or what is a description of love in 1 Corinthians 13. Yeah. So I know we usually think that's a flowery when you do it at weddings, but it's intensely practical.
Absolutely.
And so his verbiage is the fleshing out of a very well-known passage there in 1 Corinthians about whether it be patience or believing that, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. All that stuff is gold.
And again, comes right back to that first sinner, second sinned against.
Yes,
yeah.
Big time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Hey, I wanted to wrap up our conversation a little bit today. I want to ask you a question. We've got an email set up where people can submit questions because obviously emotional health can be such a complicated issue for so many people. And so we had a question come in this week that I looked at and I was like, man, this would be perfect to bring up in this idea of relationships. And so I'm just going to read this question from Ashley. She submitted it this week and just want to get your thoughts on it. And Pastor, feel free to jump in here as well. But here's what Ashley said. She said, I so enjoyed the podcast about emotional health and our children. It is something my husband and I have talked about extensively, identifying our trauma from childhood and not passing it to our children and teaching them how to deal with their big emotions in healthy ways. My mother-in-law can be difficult emotionally. She often behaves and reacts poorly and sometimes in very mean ways. I'm an adult and I can process those reactions and not reflect them or internalize them. Her emotions are not mine and I cannot be responsible for them. What I struggle with is this. Number one, what part in my daughter's life should I allow my mother-in-law to have? And then number two, how should I respond to my mother-in-law in a loving way while also setting my boundaries to protect my peace in my marriage? Super easy question, right? No, very, very complex question.
Yours.
Yeah. So. Go ahead, Kevin. You take it away from here.
Okay. Circling back to something we talked about, look at the log in your own eye before the speck in your brother's eye or your mother-in-law's eye. So do that. I mean, I'd say start there, pray on that, think on that sort of thing. Then number two, she and her husband getting on the same page. Whatever page that is, they need to be on the same one. So getting on that same page is going to be huge. So talking with him about that, making sure they're on the same page. I would suggest since it's his mom, he take the lead. He might need to talk to her individually, or they might talk with her together, but him taking the lead on this deal, I think is going to be huge. And then there's some kind of process considerations that one can take in terms of going about these things. You can go with the kind of sprinkle in method or the all at once method.
It's called the come to Jesus meeting. Is what that's called.
That's a family meeting.
It's the come to Jesus meeting. Yeah, and I'd say she doesn't need to apologize for setting healthy boundaries. Yeah. Whatever those boundaries are, they're going to be on the same team. But boundaries is not it's not a lack of forgiveness. It's not a lack of trust. And then I don't know how old it said the daughter was, but. At the appropriate age, communicate. Here are the boundaries we've set, and because those boundaries are important. They have to disciple that little girl, if I remember the scenario right. But boundaries are healthy. They're biblical. It's like so she doesn't need to be on the same page, but they don't need to apologize. Just say, all right, we don't have to expose them to this. Yeah. This is where we think the line is.
That's right.
Two very helpful answers to that.
Yeah.
I'm encouraged by that. So let's close with this. Obviously, there's been a good mix today of a little practical, theoretical, theological, all these things kind of coming together. If you're just going to leave one thing with people to understand how to navigate their emotional health and their relationships. You get 30 seconds with somebody. What is it that you're saying to that person to kind of begin that journey?
Being clear in terms of biblical worldview, pursuing the scriptures big time, have solid Christian community. You know, you can talk about football some, that sort of thing, but talk real with each other. I know we as guys often have a hard time with that, but you got to have those guys, and for ladies, those ladies who you're super real with. And then that log in your own eye thing. So, you know, keep dialing into that, praying through that, being aware of how that can show up in relationships, because it can show up so much in relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So helpful. Thank you guys both for jumping on today for this conversation. Just like the last 2 episodes, I think this one's going to be very encouraging for our people. I know I've been challenged today as well. So before we wrap up, I want to remind you guys listening, remind you watching, that we want to hear from you. Just like we read Ashley's question a moment ago, we're going to be covering a lot of stuff, and we're not going to be able to cover all of it, nor should we, but we want to make sure that we're in dialogue with you, especially when it comes to these things with emotional health. And so we've got an email set up. You can email your questions, your comments into us at podcast@biltmorechurch.com, and we're hopefully going to discuss some more of those along the way over the next few weeks. We've also got a website set up with all types of resources on it, including ones for some of these things we talked about today and some of the ones we referenced today. In addition to that, we've got a link on that website to the Summit Wellness webpage as well, if you want to learn more about kind of Kevin and their counseling center. I'd encourage you to go check that out as well. So check out all those resources. That's at canwetalkaboutit.com. I know a lot of you guys have been really excited to take advantage of some of those resources. Continue to do that over the next few weeks. We'll be adding to those as well. So above all else, I hope this encourages you. I hope it challenges you in your walk with Jesus. And we did this last week, so I'm going to throw it out there again. You guys know how we're going to close the podcast, right?
I'm hoping you're going to say you're loved and sent.
You're loved and sent. You are loved and you are sent by